Well, now we're honored to welcome author, chaplain, and military historian Duff Crerar to share his thoughts on what Remembrance Day means to him. Welcome, Duff, to the show. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you.
Well, today is Remembrance Day, a day to honor the men and women who have served and sacrificed during times of war and in peace. And so this Memorial Day began at the end of the First World War. So what personal connection do you have to this day and specifically to the First World War?
Well, my grandfather served in several battalions overseas. He was wounded and just before the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and later on was gassed. And so his life was shorter than we expected. In fact, he died before I was born. And my grandmother was a young woman, committed to the war effort, caught up in the war movement, really felt this was a crusade. And as a result, when her future husband came home, discovered another kind of reality among the veterans, and then served again as a volunteer with the Red Cross in World War II. My grandfather was too ill to travel overseas, so he served in the reserves in World War II here in Ottawa. But the bottom line was that for us, World War II overshadowed our family. My grandfather's brother went missing in action at the Battle of Passchendaele and was only discovered, his body was discovered after the battle, and he's buried in Belgium, where I was able to visit the grave later on. By the way, I should add, I'm not actually a member of the chaplain service in Canada. I have served as a teacher and advisor to them because of my book and my research. So my chaplain service is entirely voluntary, not official.
Okay, well, thank you for serving in that way. And you talked about your grandfather and his legacy. How did that impact your life and what you chose to do as a military historian?
Well, I was haunted by the war. I was haunted by the idea of family service. I would go to the cemetery and see the little cryptic note on the family tombstone that my grandfather's brother, John Campbell Crerar, had gone missing in action at Passchendaele. And so for me, up until the age of 12, the war was kind of a mysterious place of heroism and drama and sacrifice. And Remembrance Day was for me also a powerfully moving time, especially the minute of silence, because my imagination would run over what little bit I'd learned. Then around the age 12, the sort of heroism aspect was replaced by a really gripping sense of the trauma of serving in the trenches in World War I. There was a number of commemoration events and a couple of films that presented the trenches in a very different way than I had learned. And I became very quickly aware that we're talking about something that is a kind of a scar across the face of Canada. You know, we only had 8 million people in the country. Only 4 million were of military age. Out of that number, over 600,000 served, most of them overseas. We had a national chasm created by the conscription crisis, and we had 60,000 killed. So in this little country of 8 million, we had contributed as much proportionately as much larger countries, and it meant the casualty rate, and by the way, that's always 2/3 more than the number killed who were wounded or disabled by the war in World War I. So almost everybody knew someone. Everyone had a family member or a friend or someone from down the street. And that's why across Canada today, almost every little town has a cenotaph with from 5 to 50 names on it. It was a national crusade and a national trauma. And so I was drawn into trying to grasp what that was. And that took me right to the spiritual question. How do you sustain morale? How do you justify? How do you give direction to 600,000 Canadians who have given up their everyday freedom to go and put their life in their hands in what's often called the unlimited liability contract of joining the Canadian Expeditionary Force? Another question that also I took into my studies on World War II and have pursued ever since.
Wow, and thank you for putting that into perspective, because you're right. It really did impact the entire nation, and it formed a lot of our thoughts and ideas about war. So you asked some really great questions. What were your answers? What conclusions did you come to?
That's a very good question. You know, the challenge with the war was it was a total war, our first total war. Every life in Canada was touched by some aspect of it. If it wasn't service and conscription or letters from home or that dreaded yellow telegram notifying you of the casualty.
Right.
It was nevertheless the political questions, the home front's desire to serve, and the churches embraced this war. There have been enough disasters and atrocities at the beginning of the war to give Canadian churches the assumption that this was a crusade. It might even be Armageddon. Remember, it's the first time that a war of this scope had ever been waged on Earth, and only to be overhung by the terrible cost of World War II. But in both cases, so many nations, so much industrial effort, so much wealth, income tax, for example, was a permanent addition to Canadian life because of World War I. This total war meant that even children were getting mock uniforms and learning how to march. And then there was the dread of seeing returned veterans, some of them early coming back missing limbs, not able to breathe or be healthy. And then underneath, the hidden fear that existed, listed into the 40s and 50s, that whenever there was a sudden thunderstorm, that dad or uncle might suddenly begin to act very strangely and even act frightened and emotionally broken. So these things meant that for many Canadians, the war was this great war to end war. But at the same time, there was a question mark over it. Have we given so much in vain? And when so many soldiers who had come in 1915, there were revivals in the Canadian Expeditionary Force overseas, had so many of these men who had committed so much just simply not returned, and was the greatest spiritual harvest, in fact, actually buried in the graves of France and Flanders. These are big questions, and ones that still haunt us, I think, in the nation.
Yeah, and I love it. You've been noted to quote that history has a soul, and it is true. And so Remembrance Day for us is more than just remembering a war. It's also asking great questions of ourselves and of our nation and how we can be better as a nation and how we can heal. Thank you so much for your time. It was really fascinating. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us today.
You're welcome.